The age of René Descartes and Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Galileo, Robert Boyle, is also the age of Thomas Hobbes. The implications of developed science would not be lost on Hobbes, who was persuaded that if all the universe could be reduced to systematic laws, it would be very strange indeed if society itself could not be embraced by the same rational, experimental approach to problem solving. His colossal classic, Leviathan, is an expression of that judgment. It is a work in social engineering, designed as the plans for a world in which one minimizes warfare. I'm tempted to say reduces friction and civil strife. His long life spans the period 1588 to 1679, a period in which momentous political, intellectual, and scientific events took place in England and in Europe. He had a highly variegated career in his own right. He was classically educated. In fact, one of his important contributions is a quite authoritative translation of Thucydides, which went through a number of editions. For 5 years, he served as personal secretary to, yes, Francis Bacon. In fact, I've noted over a course of years that the job of a secretary can be utterly fulfilling, just in case one's boss happens to be Francis Bacon. Rarely happens. And indeed, given the scientific outlook that Hobbes would come to promote and come to adopt, we do see a Baconian influence, though Hobbes himself would be more directly influenced by his exposure to the science of Galileo. At 15, Hobbes entered Magdalen College, Oxford, and was quickly immersed in scholastic philosophy, graduating with no taste for it and then taking the post of tutor. His continental journeys of 1610 further weakened his respect for the old philosophy. His growing interest in the dangerous politics of his time leads to his translation of Thucydides, published in 1628, whose own account of war and peace makes out a good case against extreme forms of democracy. I want to pause for a moment to say that Thucydides on war is not just a subject Hobbes happened to, well, why not translate that one? Thucydides is making a point Hobbes wants to make too. Hobbes returned to the continent again in the period 1636-1637 and became associated with a circle of leading intellectuals through Father Mersenne in France. It was this association that forged a friendship with Pierre Gassendi, at the time the chief expositor of a thoroughly materialistic philosophy and materialistic psychology. Even more important in his intellectual life, Hobbes also meets Galileo in Italy and is won over completely to the new science of mechanics and begins to consider its application to the social and political world. Now this, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is also the epoch in which England will behead one king. It will have a protector. It will then have a restored monarchy. Hobbes is there for all this. He sees revolution in England, civil strife, regicide. He exiles himself in France in 1640 after publishing his Elements of Law, a work that lays the foundation for the absolute power of the monarch. It's during this exile in France that he spends time as tutor to another Englishman, the future Charles II, who 16 years later is the one who grants the Royal Charter to the Royal Society. So Hobbes's fortune, we see, was shifting, to say the least. Now back in England, he publishes Leviathan in 1651 and undertakes a number of significant disputes in print on the issue of free will, determinism, and the nature of human nature. Let's begin with Leviathan, this treatise in social and civic engineering. Hobbes's introduction leaves no doubt as to the perspective that will govern the entire work. Here's a quote. "Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also, imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, in the beginning whereof is in some principal part within, why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? But what is the heart but a spring? And the nerves but so many strings? Art goes yet further, imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, man. For by art is created that great Leviathan called a commonwealth or state, which is but an artificial man, close quote. Now, this is rather awkward prose, not in its time, but right now. Look what's being said here. God has made nature, and we find out that the God-made nature conforms to the laws of mechanics, etc. Well, why should anything that's natural be different? Society, after all, is part of the natural world. We've used our reason and our observation to solve other kinds of problems that crop up in the natural world. Political society surely isn't to be excluded from this. It is a fit subject for it. But of course, to get the show on the road, you must disabuse yourself of certain habits of mind that have prevented progress in this area in the past. So as we approach Leviathan, we discover that the first item on the agenda is to leave behind us certain absurd modes of thought, eliminating absurdity from our thinking. You see, again, this is going to be sort of Bacon-like. The ancients were the ancients. We've got to look ahead and do things in a more developed way. The approach Hobbes takes is not unlike Galileo's compositive, resolutive approach in physics, breaking down complex phenomena into parts, then building up again through systematic observation. Thus does Leviathan begin with an examination of the senses and the means by which we have knowledge of the external world, moving then to imagination, which reaches possibilities that go beyond immediate experience, then to that train of associations that lead thought into new and different directions. So his reduction of the mental realm is really quite radical. Another quote: "There is no other act of man's mind that I can remember, naturally planted in him, so as to need no other thing to the exercise of it, but to be born a man and live with the use of his five senses. Those other faculties, which seem proper to man only, are acquired and increased by study and industry, and proceed all from the invention of words and speech." Close quote. The natural tendency of imagination is toward discovery and invention. This is what distinguishes man from other animals. And on this last point, we find a revealing example offered by Hobbes, the staunch royalist. Referring to the recent Civil War, he recalls someone asking the value of a Roman penny. In Chapter 3, Hobbes traces the associations that arise from this question. Listen to this, quote, "For the thought of the war introduced the thought of delivering up the king to his enemies. The thought of that brought in the thought of delivering up Christ, and that again the thought of the 30 pence, which was the price of that treason. And all this in a moment of time, for thought is quick." Now here is the use of an associationist psychology to make a royalist point. The comparability of Judas betraying Jesus Christ and the king being turned over to his executioners. Hobbes gives central importance to speech, convinced that the perpetuation of absurdities is a kind of casualness and lack of discipline in establishing the meaning of the very terms we use to establish what makes a problem problematical. His account of the appearance of speech from the time of Adam is a pragmatic one, beginning with naming animals and objects. But the punishment inflicted on those building the Tower of Babel finds the world now divided into different linguistic enclaves. Speech does confer power, it aids memory, but it lends itself to abuses, of which Hobbes cites 4. There is first the inconstant use of terms in the process of registering our thoughts, such that we deceive ourselves into having concepts of things that are not actually experienced. Second, By metaphorical devices, we deceive others. Third, by dissimulation, Hobbes, who was persuaded that if all the universe could be reduced to systematic laws, it would be very strange indeed if society itself could not be embraced by the same rational, experimental approach to problem solving. His colossal classic, Leviathan, is an expression of that judgment. It is a work in social engineering, designed as the plans for a world in which one minimizes warfare. I'm tempted to say reduces friction and civil strife. His long life spans the period 1588 to 1679, a period in which the age of René Descartes and Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Galileo, Robert Boyle, is also the age of Thomas Hobbes. The implications of developed science would not be lost on Hobbes. Momentous political, intellectual, and scientific events took place in England and in Europe. He had a highly variegated career in his own right. He was classically educated.